forgot to say something about Russell before I came up here. So is executed. Alan Kay is a former illustrator and professional musician. Just listen to this one shot here. Alan Kay is a former illustrator and professional musician who somehow received bachelor's degrees in mathematics and molecular biology while working his way through school as a systems programmer for the National Center for Atmospheric Research and spending most of his time composing music for local theatrical productions. I mean, that is amazing. Alan has been involved with the development of the first personal computers from their very early inception, and after a short stint at Stanford Artificial Intelligence Project, he was one of the founders of Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, where he was head of the Learning Research Group and the original designer of the Dynabook personal computer and the Smalltalk programming system. And those of you that don't know this, the Smalltalk is really where this came from, this type of screen, overlapping windows, and he really was, I guess you could call him one of the fathers of the first modern personal computer. After a decade at Xerox PARC, he left to become chief scientist at Atari, where he is now. He is still an avid amateur musician. The classical pipe organ, is a member of the International Society of Organ Builders, and to paraphrase Dr. Johnson, he does not play tennis well, but one is surprised to see him play at all.
Thank you. Long ago, when I was proselytizing about the personal computer, which I must confess to you, I had a slightly different image than the boxes that are being sold today. I made a serious error, which was to talk more about some concrete examples of what a personal computer might be, rather than to try and convey the spirit of what I felt personal computing was about and let people make up their own ideas. And what we've come to after about 15 years now is some interesting but rather slavish adherence to some fairly old ideas. And so what I'd like to do today is to briefly go through some thought processes that a designer of these systems might have and get you to try and fill in the blanks. The personal computer is not personal if it isn't what you want it to be. It's not what Apple wants it to be. It's not what Xerox wants it to be. If it isn't what you want it to be, then it isn't your personal computer. And I think, remember Steve Somer from NBC talking about the television as a new American, and kinds of things television his main audience, which is middle America. And I thought how interesting it would be because you happen to be from middle America, and there are certain things that you might write that might disturb you and wouldn't allow you to feel comfortable anymore. And I think that restricting content in that way is not the way to deal with a medium. The medium is a thing that has zillions of degrees of freedom and can be shaped in ways that the inventors of the medium didn't anticipate. If it isn't that, it's no better than a tool. And to me, the computer is not a tool. The programs that run on it are tools because they direct the degrees of freedom. To me, the computer is a container for the newest kind of kinetic art. Art that moves through time, like music and ballet and so forth. It's a little more abstract, but it is that kind of material. We call it a meta-medium because its content is other media. You can see when you looked at Macintosh that what it was doing was simulating some of the aspects of paper. In fact, trying to do some of the good things about paper, like readability, and remove some of the bad things about paper, like difficult to erase and hard to insert and so forth. But it can do lots of other things. And I know you all realize that computers can simulate music, they can simulate graphics. We've seen lots of that. The most important thing about computers, though, is not their ability to simulate, but the possibility that you might be able to tailor the things that are on there to your own use. That is a reflective notion rather than an affective notion. I'm going to talk, that's really the theme of my talk, is that if I had to sum up my main complaint about 20th century, especially the time that we live in now, that it's almost totally devoted to affective hits. Things that get the glands going, but which leave you with almost nothing to reflect on even in the next minute, let alone the next day. I was on a sort of a blue ribbon panel that was convened by Disney to go down and evaluate Epcot. We did in high style for 3 days or so. And these people, who are actually from the same kind of background as the people in this conference, had many opinions about Epcot, but there was one unanimous one, and that was that none of the exhibits at Epcot had any follow-up. So there's, for instance, quite a wonderful exhibit called The Land, where you sort of go through a standard Disney and now that it's almost totally devoted to affective hits. Things that get the glands going, but which leave you with almost nothing to reflect on even in the next minute, let alone the next day. I was on a sort of a blue ribbon panel that was convened by Disney to go down and evaluate Epcot. We did in high style for 3 days or so. And these people, who are actually from the same kind of background as the people in this conference, had many opinions about Epcot, but there was one unanimous one, and that was that none of the exhibits at Epcot had any follow-up. So there's, for instance, quite a wonderful exhibit called The Land, where you sort of go through a standard Disney you saw that was significant. Well, after you got off that ride, there wasn't even a stencil on the wall telling you where to find out anything more if you wanted to learn something. There wasn't a pamphlet. There wasn't a bookstore. There wasn't any graffiti done with spray paint. There was nothing. And so they brought you up to this place where you're now interested, like the little dog in the commercial who heard the name of the ale and started juggling balls and balancing chairs and stuff, and then they just dropped you. Came up with something like water or American beer or something like that. So I think that if we think we're in the media business, and that if we think that we're designers, then we have to think of something different than the computer as a box. Maybe even something different than the computer as a vehicle. And now, it's interesting that though IBM hasn't worried about interaction in geologic times, in the ARPA community, starting around 1961 or so, the whole ethic and interest of that community has been to develop the computer as a symbiotic agent, an amplifier for human reach. This is not a new idea. It was not invented by Apple. It was not invented by Xerox. It goes back a long ways, and in fact, the intellectual precursor of this is a wonderful article which is called As We May Think, written by Vannevar Bush in 1945. This was published in Atlantic Monthly, and he predicts a number of things, including dry photography. But the major part of the article is devoted to a machine he calls Memex, which is thought of as a small desk-like thing with 2 or 3 screens on it and a way of pointing at information. And in here, by using various optical storage techniques, would be the contents of a small-town library, 5,000 or 8,000 volumes. And the principal thing that you did with this was to be able to lay down your own information trails. There were already built trails, but the idea is that you could lay down your own trails, and these became new information in that system. That article was the inspiration for the ARPA funding in interactive computing in 1961 that led to the first time-sharing system, that led to the first computer graphics, led to the first pointing devices, the first truly higher-level languages, artificial intelligence, and all of those things came from that idea. And in fact, in many ways, the spirit of the 60s was much more adventurous than the 70s or even the 80s. Back then, the machines did cost $1 million, but the kinds of things that were done on them were not fettered by any theory of making them into a product. They were done solely to try and amplify some aspect of human reach. So I thought what I would do is, since we're talking about the future, is to give you 4 ways to think about it to help predict the future. And the first one is when we started up Xerox, we had Xerox executives coming out of our ears the first couple of years, being very anxious, saying, what is the future going to be like? What are the Japanese going to do? What is going to happen to us and everything else? And I finally said, look, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. It is not something that's going to happen to us. It's something we're going to make happen. That's what research teams are all about. We will have a vision of the future. We will make a vision of the future. And as long as it doesn't violate too many of Newton's laws, we can probably make it work. Now, there's a difference between a clear vision and a good vision. And I think the hardest thing to get is a good vision. We heard about a clear one last night about Kennedy's clear vision that we should put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And I think, to me, that was a fairly terrible vision. And I'll tell you why. Because it set back space travel 20 years. Okay? He didn't say, let's invent space travel. He said, basically, let us show up the Russians. And what we got out of that was everything except space travel. We did get lots of good technology. We got even more management techniques for managing 300,000 people and $24 billion. The NASA people say themselves that was the greatest single fallout, was learning how to do really large projects. But what we didn't get is space travel, and we don't have it today. There's no travel to the moon, there's no travel to the Mars, there's no travel to anywhere in space. We're going up in orbit like we did in 1963. So the important idea, I think, is when a vision is formed, it has to have several characteristics. One is it has to be a rather long-range vision, because it unfortunately takes a very long time to get things done and out the door. In our business, this is the second point, it takes 10 years to get something out into commercial life from a new idea in a laboratory. The first personal computer actually wasn't the ENIAC. It was done in 1963, and I just went to the 20th anniversary of it a few months ago. It was done, sponsored by NIH, and it was a machine called the Link. It took 10 years to go from that machine. It was a marvelous little device, $15,000 in 1963, with its own virtual memory, its own display screen, its own interactive debugger. Several thousand of them were built. It took 10 years to go from that to the Xerox Alto, which was the first practical personal computer in 1973. First video game was done in 1962 on the PDP-1. It was called Space War. And the Nolan Bushnell's first game was called Computer Space, and it came out in 1972. So you see this 10-year time constant, and in those 10 years are usually 2 or 3 very long, very bloody implementation efforts. And it is almost unheard of for those 10 years to take place in a single company. Almost always we find a disillusionment, cherry-picking, people moving on, and so forth. And what happened at Xerox PARC is no exception. So 10 years, that's the time constant I couldn't afford to believe in long ago, but I'm afraid it's really true. Third thing is, when you're dealing in media instead of tools, you have to face up to the kind of cycle that media has gone through over the last 1,000 years. 4 main parts to it. There's a hardware-intensive phase, where most of the profits are made by margins on the hardware. This is as true in publishing as it has been in the computer business. Then, as people learn to build the hardware, the margins go down to 0, because the hardware is always the easiest thing to build. Have an industrial revolution, you can build paper like crazy. And all of a sudden, you go into a software phase, which completely changes everything around. Why? Because software has always been a cottage industry. Basically something that, unless there is a power structure in control, almost anybody can make up software for the medium. And usually what happens is a really smart hardware company will go into distribution in order to control that, because no software publishing house has ever been able to control all of its own authors and stay in business. You have to go in and distribute other people's things. The software part has a novelty phase and a value phase. What happened to Atari last year was an abrupt switch from a novelty phase to a value phase for the cartridges that they were making a substantial part of their income on. It happened about a year earlier than I thought it was going to happen. It can happen abruptly. As soon as the users get sophisticated, all of a sudden, it's not a citizens band radio anymore that they want, but cellular. They don't know it's cellular, but they have realized that this new gadget has only 40 channels, and they can't call their friend across town even if he has one. It's not a real communication system. All of a sudden, they want something real. And the citizens band radio goes in the back of the closet and waits for that value-laden piece of technology to come along. Now, the most important phase, I think, is the next one. And this is the one that is absolutely critical to thinking about this new field that we're in. And that is the service phase. I think, in fact, the big revolution in my own thinking about personal computer, which happened in 1968-69, really came about by understanding that the computer was not a piece of hardware and it was not a piece of software. I thought I was being very adventurous back then in bundling the two together, designing the hardware and the software at the same time. But I finally realized that what the computer is a gadget that delivers service. That's what people want. They want service from it. This is a service concept. It's not a hardware or software concept. Service is a bundling of attributes to satisfy a person's perceived needs. The Japanese sell their cars more like transportation services than they do, as GM did for so many years, as a menu of features that you could buy, and having 300 horsepower or 400 horsepower or a scoop or chrome or extra tail fins. Service. And that service area is the one in which medium development is most critical. It's the one that tells you what to do. My main bitch about the way personal computers have gone over the last decade is that it has been very far away from that idea. It's been first selling the hardware, just in the life phase that we're talking about. Now software is all over the place. Software delivers service. The integrated concept that we see in Macintosh is wonderful. I'm glad that Apple is doing that, but we have to realize that those ideas go back to 1972. And so what we must ask is, where are the things that we actually need for the 1980s? Now, the final phase in this four-part thing is when a service becomes a way of life, like this, like a telephone. A way of life is that gadget that you only notice when it isn't there. We'd immediately notice if there weren't telephones in our hotel room. We'd immediately notice if we didn't have one of these things. And I think that's the destiny of communications media, to be pushed towards being a way of life, providing they fit into all of the crevices and mundanities and amplification needs that people actually want. That last word brings me to the fourth idea for predicting the future. And I think everybody has realized by now that market analysis doesn't work very well. It's not clear that it even works over a 2-year period, and it absolutely has been disastrous over anything longer than a 2-year period. The Xerox machine is a perfect case in point. Dessauer writes in his book about how they took the Xerox 914 to IBM and said, "We don't have enough money to build factories for this. Why don't you build it and just give us a royalty?" And IBM went to Arthur B. Little in Cambridge and said, "Should we?" And Arthur B. Little, after an 18-month market survey, came back and said, "No. Nobody will pay a nickel a copy. It's too expensive. Nobody copies like that. There's not enough copy volume." That was many billions of dollars ago. Dessauer's book was called "My Years with Xerox, the Billions Nobody Wanted." And Jack Goldman, the chief scientist of Xerox, just retired, and he's writing a book. I said, "Jack, you should call it Xerox and the Personal Computer, the Billions They Didn't Want." Because again, we have this recognition problem. Xerox did it to itself. You may not know this, but Steve Jobs worked for Atari. And in fact, the Apple I was taken to Nolan Bushnell, the then president of Atari, and was turned down as not being a valid concept. And this was after Nolan had left Ampex, because Ampex wouldn't believe in the idea of a video game. So all of these things led to a saying that I made up, which is, point of view is worth 80 IQ points. The reason is that after Xerox turned down all of the stuff that had been built at PARC, I met, after a year, if I'd met him the next day, I would have killed him. But after a year, I met the person who made that decision and realized to my great surprise that he was not a dodo, as I had thought. He was just a perfectly reasonable, rather intelligent Xerox executive who had no possible way of evaluating the decision that he had to make. He made the wrong one, and that changed the face of computing in America. But he himself was a copier executive, and he had no way of telling whether what we were doing was just something interesting in the lab or something fundamental. And I believe that is the number one problem in doing something interesting with technology. The tendency is to cater to the marketing people who are basically not into the value system that the really good technology can bring about. So there's a real tendency towards building the trivial and leaving out the Olympian gestures, which I think are what we need many more of. All right. I guess the one thing I should say about the De Bono idea, I never liked that when I read De Bono's book, because who wants to be in a hole, even if it's a new one? I think it's much better to find a hill and climb up on it. You can see a lot farther. You're in a hole, all you see is dirt. Maybe you're dirt, but it's still only dirt. That brings me to a good quote by Heinlein, which said, "The strongest weapon you have is the one between your ears, providing it's loaded." You see, I'm very close to being a Luddite. And the reason I am is because this is a technique-crazy century. We have finally found out how to make technique work for us, and has led to enormous technologies we've been talking about over the next days. It has led in musical conservatories to the faster Chopin Major Third Etudes than Thou phenomenon of piano players and stuff. It is basically an age that is extremely interested in the quantitative and has extreme difficulties with dealing with any value system. And this is disastrous. So what I'd like to do is just show you a couple of quick slides and give you an idea of what a vision was like back in the early 70s. And then in the few moments remaining, get you to think about, along with me, about what should this thing be. So that is the place where you always start off. We have to start off with values, saying what should this be. Don't worry about the technology. Honestly, if not us, then the Japanese can probably make a display out of this wooden floor if they wanted to. It's not really that difficult. Glorifying technology is like deciding that the layout of an ad is good, but the message of it is bad, and therefore it's still a good ad. I don't think that's the way to think about it. Okay, if you could focus that a little bit, that would be... Good. Well, this is just memory lane. This is a machine that I was the co-designer of in 1968. And it was not the first personal computer, as I mentioned. It was probably the second one. But as you see, it had all of the things that we have come to recognize. It had a high-resolution display screen. It had windows. It had a tablet for pointing and had a keyboard. And this machine ran a little hotter than the Macintosh. It had almost 700 ICs in it, so you could heat. We had a little perch on the top of it for heating our coffee pots. But nonetheless, it ran a higher level language. There was almost a pure object-oriented language, so it had all of the things that people are writing about now in Time magazine. The unfortunate thing about this was that it was a total disaster when we tried it out on our users. Our users were people who were supposed to be doctors and lawyers and engineers, professional people who needed to wield a tool on their own behalf. And in fact, I discovered that I'd done a terrible job, even with Windows and all of these things, in doing the human factors of interaction. And that was the first time I ever thought that the human factors of interaction was really important. Now, I've come since to believe that it is the important thing because it is the only thing the user ever sees. No other thing in the computer is important. And it led to the idea of the box not being very important, because look at that system and you realize that there are only a few square inches, not cubic inches, that are important. That's the face of the display screen. And almost everything else is superfluous. So, if we could turn the slides off for 1 second. After licking my wounds for a couple of years, because it was really painful to put blood into something over a period of some years and have it turn out to be a disaster. And so I went off and did other things for a while. But thinking about it, in 1968 I had also seen the first flat panel display at the University of Illinois, and I realized it was not going to be too long before we could do away with all those cubic inches and start worrying about the square inches that count. And also at Utah, Ivan Sutherland had done his head-mounted display. A display you could put on like glasses and actually walk around in your display area. So when I went to Xerox with our lure of 10-year blank check funding, these were the two physical ideas for what a machine in the 1980s could be. And of course, why were we thinking the 1980s? Because we had 10 years. And so we just extrapolated the hardware out and decided, yes, machines like the Dynabook are definitely possible. These are two forms. Now, I put that big green question mark there because I don't believe that these are the only forms. In fact, I believe something more like what Nick Negroponte talked about in the first lecture may be even more appropriate. Now, the glasses one, I think, is going to work out for a variety of reasons. It is the only thing in which you do not have to worry about how large your display is. It is the entire world, and the glasses at Utah measured where your head was looking. So as you looked around, the display would change. So you'd have something over here and something over here, and you could walk through the display. We even did a thing where we made the speed of light 1 foot per second. So as you lunged at things, you were acting like a photon, and the display would collapse away from you using the relativistic transforms. So you could experience different physics. You could experience what it was like to get close to a black hole without getting eaten up. Now, the problem with almost all displays is that they're too small. That is where the overlapping windows came from. It's not a feature. It is a bug. Okay, and to have it turned into a religion now really makes me worried a little bit, because if you realize about it, what you'd really like to do is have everything spread out so you could see it. The overlapping window thing was done because you don't have that much room, and you still would like to be reminded what's on the screen. I don't think that is a display that is suitable for thinking about now. We should not be doing that. Okay, back to the slide. This is a machine we built in 1973. We eventually built about 2,000 of these. The pledge we took at Xerox, very different from the way we'd done things before, that we'd never build a system that was not engineered for 100 users. So all of the stuff we'd done before was totally bubble-gummed together, and it barely worked for the designer. Here we decided we were going to have to set up a community, hook together with a network, and work with it for several years. So the screen there was that shape because the Dynabook was that shape. The dots are on and off because we thought liquid crystal would be on and off. Now, why would anybody in their right mind use a video display that can do grayscale modulation and just do on or off dots? Especially when you saw what Nick Negroponte could do with soft fonts. You can get much higher subjective resolution by using grayscale modulation. Bitmap displays today are a slavish adherence to something that was originally done to simulate a liquid crystal display. In fact, I still have the boot marks on my back from Xerox management when they were doing the star, and I tried to talk them out of going with the bitmap, but it was too late. What they understood was that bitmaps were good. That was their take on it, and they didn't want to think about what it meant for a human being to sit in front of a display. The infamous mouse. Well, we didn't invent it. Mouse was actually invented in 1965 at SRI. Why did we use it? Well, because we didn't have a good touch-sensitive display. Why are people using it now? I don't know. There must be a reason. But in fact, for immediacy and contact, it is possible to use a touch-sensitive display much better. In fact, the Dynabook was designed so that you only displayed the keyboard when you needed it. You don't really want a keyboard for hardly anything except certain kinds of typing. And the rest of the stuff, you want to be as close and immediate as possible. The original Dynabook did have a stylus in it for doing high-resolution kinds of things. So what we have here today are several technologies that were there for expedient reasons back in 1972 when hardware was very expensive, and for purposes of simulating a flat-screen display that have no relevance today. And it is no good saying that this is better than the IBM PC, because relative judgments have no place in art. We don't care whether a Beethoven symphony is better than a Brahms symphony. What we care is it good music or not? And I think that is the design ideal that we should go with. Okay, here's the first painting system. This was done in 1972. This is a picture from then, and this is a system that Stuart Brand used that year. I might mention here that the whole Earth catalog was a tremendous influence on the Dynabook design, because the Dynabook was always thought to be a networked system, not a standalone system. That's another bug in the personal computer market. A computer computer is a communications device, first, second, and third. That is what it is for, because you communicate with yourself through it, like you do with paper, and you should be able to communicate with other people and other resources. Critically important. Now, you've seen the fonts, but here's, I thought you'd be interested in a picture from 1972. The Alto had about 30 or 40% more dots than the Apple Lisa, and those dots were half the number of dots we thought were necessary. Had 500,000 dots, and we had thought that 1 million were necessary. So again, the ability to do things that the human eye can read and appreciate are incredibly important. Again, old pictures, integrating text and drawing. The pencil was one of our favorite metaphors. Remember, portability is not 0.5 herniations per block. Really isn't. The phrase I made up back then was something so portable you can carry other things too. Like 2 sacks of groceries. The idea on a personal communications medium is you don't want to ever give the person the opportunity for deciding to leave it behind. Or you've missed it. You've missed the service aspects of it, and you've totally missed its possibilities for becoming a way of life. Absolutely critical. Here's one of the earliest window things. Windows, as I think everybody knows, are actually the back end of telescopes that look into different information systems. The ones with the multiple panes there were designed by Larry Tesler, who is now at Apple, and they're used for browsing. One of the earliest of the integrated text and graphics editors, where the tokenish font is being created there. Actually, it's going blurry, more and more blurry, and you can see that the painting system in this, on the Alto, is integrated into the document, so that you didn't go out to some separate system, but it was just one of the many kinds of paragraphs. So you can think of a paragraph as a window, can't you? Sort of a rectangular thing, and some paragraphs can have pictures in them, some might want to have graphs in them, some might want to have animations in them, some might want to have text in them, and the document is really the system concept that unifies these. This is an interesting program because it was the first time that real-time note capture was done. It was done by a 15-year-old child. Now, I usually travel. I wasn't planning on talking here. I had the slides along because I'm working on a talk in a couple of months from now. I usually travel with movies and videotapes, and the reason is that, as Lee Harrison said long ago, he says, a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but if it moves, see it. And it's no good talking about a kinetic art like I am and show you static pictures, but that's the best we can do today. So this you could just play in and it would capture the notes, and it's one of the earliest programs. This is a musical notation that we use for teaching children that is much easier for them to use than the standard one. And this system was its own synthesizer. You didn't have to hook one onto it. The system was simply fast enough to do essentially what the synclavier does with 12 real-time parallel voices. And you could define all of the timbres by simply drawing in on the screen. This is an animation system that was originally designed by Eric Martin, who is here. This was done in 1974, and this is as modified by a child to add features to. And this could deal with about 8 objects that large in multiple planes in real time. Early planning system showing resource allocation. This is a non-procedural programming system. You can think of it as like VisiCalc, except you construct diagrams which automatically run. So the system, for instance, does not know anything about electrical circuits. As with VisiCalc, you make drawings. Here you make drawings and tell one what they need. So if you're using VisiCalc, you would tell the resistor that your rule is Ohm's law. But much more complicated than VisiCalc, it's able to deal with very complex topologies, and so just the act of hooking a circuit together will make it run. You can build a variety of simulations that way. We worked with about 600 or 700 children. This was all done before 1976, by the way. Here's a setup in a classroom in one of the Palo Alto schools. Worked with several hundred adults. This is you see the adults are a lot tenser than the kids are. This is the chief scientist of Xerox, Jack Goldman. Now, when it comes right down to it, talking about technology doesn't help you very much. In fact, talking about entertainment design is not as critical as last night we were talking about PED, and I think the letters CPR kept on coming to mind.
For your swivels, you'll be doing something. I'd rather have you all on exercycle.
Tom Lehrer said Brinkley and Hundley discussing contrapuntally.
Yeah. Okay, that's enough house life. That's great. The kind of questions that would be interesting for you as well as us, I think, would be, here you've been getting reflective hits for 3-4 days, and some of them presumably are still festering. The good ones are. And maybe raise questions that come out of that process, the things that you're puzzling about, that you would like to keep puzzling about, and you wouldn't mind either or both of us puzzling at with you. Question right here. Mm-hmm. You don't like the expanded challenge reinforcement procedure. What do you like? A problem that you've solved, and here's the solution, and congratulations, and the screen flashes on and off, little music plays, and then what? Uh-huh. Interesting. Alan?
Well, I think the question is, does it get you too close to the myth of Sisyphus? Because if you remember that poor person that was doomed to move the big ball up the hill and then down again every day. I think that is a metaphor that's been used for too tight a loop in the challenge. But if you think of the reward for learning how to drive a car is not just the gratification of getting to where you want to go, but the challenge of exploring. I think it's a very dull person indeed that just uses their car to go down to the grocery store. They eventually get the idea that they can go to places that they haven't thought of before and do it. And I think that what Stuart was referring to is something more like what I was saying in the secondary. The affective hit is this reward thing, and the reflective thing is the thing that may not happen in the first few seconds, but that as the emotions start to drain away, they'll go very quickly if there isn't something to hang on there. And that hanging on is usually thinking more about it, which is illuminating the challenge a little bit further. Sure, I think you can imagine, taking Stuart's bathroom analogy, you can imagine the horrors of a video game designed to challenge you, but they say the Highland Fling was invented by putting a Scotsman in front of a pay toilet. It's a typical conflict of interest there, and I think that kind of a challenge is not a good idea.
How many people here have tried typing tutor? 1, 2, or 3? If you're messing around with keyboards at all, it's one of the quickest change your life programs you can hang out with, because it adds an interesting element. It not only knows immediately if you're hitting the right keys as you leads you through these very easy to begin and very easy to get into exercises, but it notices how quickly you hit the keys and gives you little charts of that your left little finger is still lagging behind the rest. Doesn't punish you for that. It just indicates on the chart there's this tall little left finger, and it gives you more of the keys for that finger. It knows where you're slow and picks you up. And my God, you can become a quick typist quick with these programs. There's several of them. I think so far Typing Tutor is the best. Does it pat you on the butt? No. But as soon as you turn off that program and put in anything else, you're typing like a bastard. And that's patting you on the butt.
Maybe the question is whether the successful program is challenging you without realizing it. The experience of, for instance, learning to play tennis can be extremely painful or fairly rewarding, and it often has to do with how judgmental you are as you're going through the thing. So the challenge may be something that you're simply looking forward to. I was thinking I sort of lump music into two classes. There's music that the more you understand about it, the more mundane it seems to you. And there's other music that the more you understand about it, the better it seems. It opens up. It's like learning about the molecular biology of the cell, which is one of the most beautiful stories of all time. The more people find out about it, the more wonderful it is to experience it. And it's that opening up thing. See, I think that the media we shouldn't be sending the message that this or that is good. But the message that the media could present is that there's more than one way, and it gets better. And these little ramp functions that I think let people choose their own paths. And I think it's those little ramp functions that we as designers should be trying to understand what they are. We shouldn't be packaging religion. And I don't think a ramp function is religion, it's excitement.
Why don't you pick a question?
Okay. Well, Marvin Denikoff once said, you can get through your 40s without a plan, but you have to have a plan for 50s. And I will be 53 in 10 years. So I guess I should start making a plan. So I think the trick on all of this stuff I think design is simply finding a way of re-entering yourself as though you hadn't done anything before, but all that stuff that you've learned is an arsenal that you can bring to bear after you've gotten the next idea. And going at it the other way is really difficult because the tendency is to use those old ideas as the form of the new design. That's disaster. You get trapped into a very narrow genre. So I think that's something that everybody who works creatively, and I think that's most people, has to face, is how to find those. For instance, music is wonderful because you can't run out of it. Schumann said about Bach's music that the more you understand it, the better it is. You cannot die unhappy having experienced Bach. And that's surely one of the great experiences of the universe, that we live in one that has that kind of richness in it. And I think everybody who has a love like that knows what I mean. They're personal loves that are the most important things about humanity, I think.
And yet, the hackers made Space War, not the planners. And I'll be 55 in 10 years. The fantasy is to stay a hacker, and not be a snail who's getting larger and larger with the burden of one's own past riding around. To a certain extent, success, and this is this either successful or soon-to-be successful bunch, is mostly all reward. There's some problems with that. I think it's one of the peculiarities that we see with the personal computer realm right now, and maybe this is true of other aspects of technology and entertainment, is that people like us are so enormously rewarded for being about a half inch in front of what everybody else is doing, that why ever would we be interested in what's 2 or 3 feet in front of what everybody else is doing? And so this successful bunch of people may be more inclined to meteorite than others who have a more cometary orbit, who are way out there, out of sight, not able to know about or come to gatherings like this, and will come through and make a hell of a tale. And then, go out and do it again. I don't know. The metaphor may break down. But I am aware, very much as Alan was saying, of how much what I've done gets in the way of what I want to do. I had a wonderful afternoon once with Milton Friedman, who I didn't expect to like as much as I did. Completely charming man. And I asked what was the effect of Nobel Prizes, not a very original question, on the Nobel Prize winners. And he said, well, I wasn't going to take it, but they'd just given it to, what's his name, the year before, who was a conservative economist. And if I hadn't taken it, it would have been an insult to him, and I didn't want to do that. So I took the Nobel Prize. And I said, what was he getting your way? He says, I don't know yet, but I can tell you generally that people should change their professions a couple of times. And there's a couple of break points. And he said, yours is probably coming up. Question. Back there.
Well, one of the things I was going to say this morning, I left it out for time purposes, is an interesting progression drawn from sort of 3 or 4 different sources. One is Piaget, who points out that the 3 major stages in his development for children are a bodily conscious phase, a whole is to dig, a visual phase, and a symbolic phase. It's finally gotten into around 12. Each one of them has its own rules of logic. Brunner, the psychologist at Harvard, showed that those phases are not sequential, but are all going on at the same time, and there's a dominance change, because you can switch people who are on the boundary from one to the other and back again very easily. Hadamard, who was a great mathematician, French mathematician, right after World War II, did a famous study called Psychology of Invention in the Mathematical Field, where he took the 100 people he thought were the greatest mathematicians on Earth and interviewed all of them. This is when he was about 85 when he did this. And of those 100, only 2 claimed to use mathematical symbology for doing their thing. All of them used visual, and about 30% of them used muscular sensations. Einstein, in particular, had kinesthetic sensations, as he said, of the muscular type. And so one hand wave of thinking about that is that creativity is a way of reaching back, maybe back to other evolutionary brains, if you believe the 3-brain idea, that going back through the visual, certainly through a looser set of rules, and back all the way to body knowledge. When we teach children how to program in Logo, we can get them to do things like drawing circles, which high schoolers can't do in BASIC, because their body knows how to draw a circle, providing you're in the right coordinate system. Circle is x squared plus y squared equals r squared, which is a bitch for anybody. Nobody remembers it, and it's hard to write the program. But in Logo, which uses child-centered coordinates, you close your eyes and think about drawing one. You ask the kid, what are you doing? And he says, I'm going a little and turning a little. You type that into Logo and draw a perfect circle. Because in inertial coordinates, that is exactly what a circle is. The differential equation of a circle is constant curvature, which is going a little and turning a little the same amount. And so kids' bodies, and you can teach 5-year-olds a lot of mathematics at that level. You're not teaching them differential calculus at the level of mathematical symbols, but you can teach them calculus at the level of their body knowledge if you have a language that can deal with that. And that's why that's in Logo. That was put in there specifically for that purpose. And again, you have these 3 ways. You can tell somebody, you can show them, and you can get them to do it. I think we all agree that getting to do it involves you in a much more visceral fashion. It's like Stuart was saying with the big guy with the pulling the paper out of the slot there. I think that the way of approaching this is to try and teach all 3 of these cognitive systems, and to realize that the oldest one is the one that is least understood and has the most buried knowledge, which is the muscular one. It is the one that really deals with navigating around the world. We can be blind, and we can still find our way around. There's a whole set of body knowledge, and this is really where, as Benoit Mandelbrot said yesterday, one of the things that he did that was most critical is to bring back the visual, and I would say even bring back the body in mathematics. That is where all this. Euler was one of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived. Said science is what you use after you guess well. And in fact, he was a notorious guesser because almost none of the proofs that he supplied for his theorems were valid, but almost all of his theorems were true. He's furnished PhD theses for generations of graduate students of finding the real proof for one of Euler's theorems.
When I don't know how to answer a question, which I don't know how to answer yours, I generally point at something. I just now pointed at Alan. But something else I would point at is the video disc demonstration that Negroponte had of the talking heads, the 4 faces that were. Maybe not all of you heard the discussion after that where someone asked, what was that work done for? And he said, I thought everybody knew it was done for the top of the American chain of command, the cabinet officers who would succeed each other in the event of nuclear war and all of this, because you can't have all of those people in one place. You lose them all at once. The Speaker of the House or somebody will be in charge. They don't want that. So, the Secretary of this and that goes to different locations underground, but they wanted to be able to communicate with each other in a way that preserved nuance, assuming that nuance might be of the essence. If somebody was saying, Mr. President, I don't think we should bomb them just yet. Nod. You really want to sort of get across as broad information as you can. And indeed, that then the President turns, is interrupted, and looks at the person who's interrupted, and acknowledges the interruption and hears him out. That's visual, it's kinesthetic, it's a lot of things. It's pretty important to communication that's that important. Question here.
You talked about education of simultaneous and intuitive processing. Is there anything that you do consciously to encourage and process intuition, altered states of consciousness?
No, actually, the secret to whatever success I've had is that by circumstance, I've always treated computer science as a hobby, and so I've never. You should see me when I get at the console of an organ. I go absolutely rigid with fright, and I don't want to fail at that. And I've never cared about the computer science stuff. It's always been great fun. It's the ideal unification of all the things I've been interested in all my life. And I think that the question of intuition is largely two things. One is just letting them happen because everybody has them. The other one is throwing away almost all of them because a good project takes as long as a great one. And after I think the trick is to pick and choose ones where the ideas will still be interesting after you've done those horrible implementations to try them out. And no, I don't. I think that I think everybody, there are lots. When I was at Park, we had lots of heavy-duty thinkers there, and they really fell into 4 or 5 different classes. There are completely different ways of looking at it. There are people there who are unbelievably brilliant, who could just deal with complexity directly. Butler Lamson is certainly one of the smartest people I've ever met in my entire life. He talks twice as fast. His mind works twice as fast. He remembers twice as much. He's just a remarkable person. I'm almost exactly the opposite from that. I like metaphor. I like longer problems. He likes shorter ones. So I think that I've always thought of our profession as being more like a theatrical repertory company where you have 20 or 30 people who ultimately get together and do all of the things. There are some people behind the scenes. Obviously the small talk stuff was not done by me alone. I thought up the original ideas, but I'm a starter, not a finisher. I had some fabulous finishers, and a lot of the stuff that was done were original contributions. Larry Tesler, for instance, who was one of the infectors of the Park culture at Apple, is one of the best software designers I know. And you could not, in a few words, acknowledge his contribution to that, or any other 5 people. So I don't think of these things as so much a group. I don't think of this as democracy. There is no such thing as democracy when you're doing design. You don't sit around and take a vote any more than you do in the theater. But what you have is different contributions that eventually come down to some kind of image. I made the original Dynabook model solely to avoid having meetings on what it was that we're trying to do. I went out and got a picture frame that was about the right size, and I faked what the display would look like, and I just put it up on the wall. And whenever anybody wanted to know what we were doing, I just point at it. Whatever, just go for it. And I only hired people that absolutely went nuts when I would wave the thing in front of a meeting. They would come up with stars in their eyes, and we'd invite them for the summer. And because we didn't have a strong definition of it, except that this wasn't a computer. This was a channel, an amplifier. It was all these things, and we knew how we were going to preliminarily deal with it, but not ultimately. See, the wonderful thing about paper, in fact, we even tested out the Dynabook to see you could hit a ball with it. One of the things about paper, all these wonderful things like paper airplanes you could do. And, we even thought of an edible Dynabook. This is one of the great ways of getting rid of this technology. If they just make it edible, you could eat your IBM PC before it got stale.
Yeah. That question always comes up. How do you inspire, instruct, improve intuition, if it's at all possible? One way, if you don't have it, is to hire it if you're doing something. The person I use most in this regard is a character named Gregory Bateson, who was a scientist, sort of, but he had the intuition of an elephant. He was just completely larger than the man, and wrote largely from that intuition. And an interview I did with him once, I asked how he did a paper. This again comes to the planning question. He said, I take a subject that I don't understand and why it is that way, and I wrestle with it. And that wrestling is the paper. He always had an enormous respect. That question always comes up. How do you inspire, instruct, improve intuition, if it's at all possible? One way, if you don't have it, is to hire it if you're doing something. The person I use most in this regard is a character named Gregory Bateson, who was a scientist, sort of, but he had the intuition of an elephant. He was just completely larger than the man, and wrote largely from that intuition. And an interview I did with him once, I asked how he did a paper. This again comes to the planning question. He said, I take a subject that I don't understand and why it is that way, and I wrestle with it. And that wrestling is the paper. He always had an enormous respect